It was the summer of 2003 in Phoenix, Arizona, and my friends and I were buzzing with excitement. We had been waiting months for this day. The Red Hot Chili Peppers were finally performing in our city. For a group of teenagers with little else to do during the long, hot Arizona summer, this concert was the highlight of our year. The city streets were alive with energy as fans of all ages streamed toward the arena, and the distant hum of car engines and chatter of excited fans filled the air. I could barely contain my anticipation as we approached the entrance. Tickets clutched tightly in our hands, the scent of concession stands and sun-warmed pavements surrounding us. For context, my friends and I weren't exactly the most cautious group. We had a rebellious streak, always looking for the thrill of doing something slightly risky, the kind of choices our parents would probably disapprove of. Hitchhiking had never been on my personal radar, but it was something my friends occasionally joked about, always claiming it was safe if you knew what you were doing. That evening, though, fate would test just how safe it really was. The concert itself was everything we had hoped for. The music, the lights, the roar of the crowd, it was electric. We sang along to every word, jumped to every beat, and lost ourselves in the thrill of being young, free, and in the midst of something unforgettable. But as the final notes faded and the stage lights dimmed, reality began to creep back in. We had to figure out how to get home. I called my mom to pick us up, expecting the usual cheerful response, but she sounded stressed over the phone, explaining that her car wouldn't start and my sister had taken the other vehicle somewhere else. Essentially, we were stranded. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, the excitement of the concert giving way to the creeping tension of being stuck in an unfamiliar part of town at night. One of my friends, with that trademark overconfidence that teenagers seem to carry, suggested hitchhiking. He claimed he had done it many times before, always successfully. I was hesitant. The idea of getting into a stranger's car after dark had never appealed to me. But in the moment, the combination of exhaustion, heat, and the realization that we had no other options nudged me toward agreement. After some debate and light persuasion, we decided to take the risk. We left the arena, stepping into the warm night air. The streets were quieter now, a stark contrast to the thrumming energy we had just left behind. Neon signs buzzed faintly from distant businesses, streetlights flickered overhead, and the occasional car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating our anxious faces. We positioned ourselves on the sidewalk, thumbs outstretched, signaling that we needed a ride. Each passing vehicle that ignored us ratcheted up the tension, our collective unease growing with every minute. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, a car finally slowed. It was an older model sedan, and inside were two men, possibly in their early 30s, both casually hitting vapes as they rolled down the window. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. They smiled and nodded, agreeing to take us home for a small fee. Relief washed over us, a temporary balm for the tension that had been building. But the moment the doors closed and the car began moving, I noticed something subtle yet unsettling. Their behavior was off. The men spoke sparingly, their movements precise, almost too calculated. There was a quiet intensity in their expressions, a stillness that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something about them felt wrong. My friends chatted casually, laughing nervously, trying to mask their unease. But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut that we had made a grave mistake. The city lights passed by in a blur as we drove, streets emptying, shadows stretching across the pavement. The car took a turn that didn't match the route to my house, and I realized with a jolt that the drivers were deviating from the expected path. One of them casually mentioned needing to pick something up from a friend, claiming it was on the way. We hesitated, but ultimately said nothing, not wanting to risk confrontation. As the car moved deeper into unfamiliar areas, the tension escalated, thickening the air like a storm about to break. Then the empty plaza appeared, dimly lit and eerily quiet, with a few cars parked haphazardly and several figures standing outside. The plaza felt immediately wrong. The men got out, leaving us in the car, and I could see the intensity of the situation in their body language. They spoke quietly to the people outside, occasional glances in our direction sending shivers down my spine. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me. It was in that moment I realized we weren't just dealing with strangers, asking for a few bucks. Something far more dangerous was at play. Every instinct screamed at me that we had entered a situation beyond our control, that our casual agreement to a ride had spiraled into a confrontation with unknown and potentially lethal forces. The music and excitement of the concert had faded entirely, replaced by the raw terror of the unknown. I don't know how long we sat in that car, frozen in disbelief, hearts hammering as the situation outside unfolded. Every second stretched into an eternity. The casual summer night had transformed into a nightmare, one that none of us could have imagined. When we first clapped along to the opening chords of our favorite band, and it all started with what seemed like a simple, harmless decision to hitchhike home after a concert. The tension in the car was unbearable. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, our excitement from the concert long gone, replaced by a creeping, gnawing fear. The drivers, who had initially seemed casual and harmless, were now clearly involved in something far more serious. Their faces were set, rigid, and their movements deliberate. My gut screamed at me that the situation had escalated beyond anything we could have anticipated. As we followed their instructions, our car approached the empty plaza. The streetlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, ominous shadows across the asphalt. Outside, a few men stood near another car, their presence immediately intimidating. Two of them were massive, broad-shouldered figures that seemed to dominate the space around them, while a third wore a black mask that covered his face completely. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine, and I realized with dawning horror that this wasn't just a casual encounter. These were dangerous people, likely involved in organized crime. The driver stepped out of our car, leaving one of the windows partially open, allowing us to hear snippets of their conversation. At first, we didn't understand what was being said, but soon it became terrifyingly clear. They were discussing debts, money owed for illegal activities, possibly drugs. The masked figure spoke with authority, issuing instructions and threats that made my heart race. One of my friends, who could understand a bit of Spanish thanks to his background, whispered urgently to us that they were involved with a cartel. Fear gripped us instantly. We were sitting in a car with people who had connections to violent criminals. Time seemed to stretch as we watched from the car. The men outside were methodical, their actions precise, almost ritualistic in nature. The driver who had picked us up, sweating profusely, begged and pleaded, clearly terrified. Every word, every gesture from the masked man exuded power and control. My friends and I were frozen, unable to move, our minds racing as we tried to process the gravity of the situation. If things went wrong, we knew there was no telling what might happen. Then came the moment that truly shook us to the core. One of the cartel members pulled out a gun, pressing it to the driver's head. The sight was surreal, a horrifying snapshot of violence that felt like it had been ripped straight from a movie. The driver was trembling, promising to pay the money owed, begging desperately for his life and the safety of his family. Our hearts pounded in unison, each second stretching into an eternity. The masked man spoke in rapid Spanish, threatening not only the driver but his family, including a 6-month-old child. My friends and I, partially understanding the language, could grasp the cruel intent behind their words. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, to flee, but fear held us in place. The tension was almost unbearable, the oppressive weight of the situation pressing down on us from every direction. My mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. Could we escape? Could we survive this? The men were clearly dangerous, and any wrong move could provoke violence. The plaza felt like a trap, a cage with invisible walls, holding us hostage in a nightmare we couldn't control. Suddenly, 2 of the cartel members turned their attention toward us in the car. Our windows weren't tinted, and the dim plaza lighting made it easy for them to see us. They approached cautiously, but with the authority and confidence of people who knew they could enforce their will without hesitation. My friends and I were paralyzed, our breathing shallow, as they motioned for us to roll down the window. Hesitantly, we complied, hands trembling. One of the masked men spoke with a heavy accent, issuing words that sent a shiver down my spine. He warned us to never speak of what we had witnessed, threatening that any attempt to reveal their activities would result in consequences not just for us, but for our families as well. The message was clear: silence was mandatory, and defiance would not be tolerated. I felt nausea rise in my throat, but I forced myself to remain composed. Any visible sign of fear or panic could have provoked them further. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the drivers returned to the car. The air was thick with tension, but they assured us that everything was fine, that we had nothing to worry about. We were too shaken to respond, our minds struggling to process the sheer intensity of the events we had just witnessed. The remainder of the drive was silent, punctuated only by the occasional turn or stop at traffic lights. None of us spoke, all too aware that any conversation might break the fragile calm that had settled over the car. When we finally arrived at my house, the drivers issued a final warning: never speak of what had happened. We nodded, too terrified to do anything but comply. As they drove away, a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear settled over us. We were alive, unharmed physically, but the psychological impact was undeniable. The image of the masked man, the gun, and the threats against the driver and his family would haunt us for years to come. Inside, we tried to compose ourselves, removing our jackets, taking deep breaths, and attempting to pretend nothing had happened. My parents noticed our pale faces, the tension in our bodies, and the jittery energy that refused to dissipate. We told them we were tired from the concert, avoiding any mention of the terrifying events we had witnessed. It was impossible to explain without sounding insane, and we feared that even sharing fragments of the story could put us in danger. Over the next few weeks, we discussed what had happened constantly, trying to make sense of it. How did they know the driver? Was he involved willingly or coerced into the cartel's activities? How had they known where he lived and about his family? These questions had no answers. The uncertainty, the unknown, and the sheer audacity of the events left an indelible mark on our minds. Even months later, the memory lingered. Every time I saw a dark plaza, a masked figure, or a gun in a movie, I felt the cold grip of fear return. The experience had changed the way we thought about strangers, about risk, and about the seemingly innocent act of accepting a ride. What had started as a fun, rebellious decision to hitchhike home after a concert had turned into a nightmare that none of us would ever forget. After that harrowing night, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of the plaza and the masked cartel member haunted us constantly. My friends and I avoided discussing it with anyone outside our circle, fearing that even a casual mention could bring repercussions. Every time the conversation drifted toward the topic, tension returned like a cold, unwelcome shadow, reminding us that we had narrowly escaped a situation far more dangerous than we could have imagined. We tried to rationalize what had happened. Could it have been a bluff? Perhaps they were just trying to scare us, to intimidate the driver. My friends and I debated endlessly, but as time passed, it became clear that this was no simple trick. The precision, the power displayed by the masked men, and the sheer threat to a family we didn't even know, all pointed to an organized, real threat. We weren't just witnesses to minor criminal activity. We had been in the crosshairs of something serious and dangerous. Our driver, despite surviving that night, changed afterward. The carefree demeanor he had carried before seemed to vanish completely. He became cautious, wary, and visibly tense whenever he drove through certain parts of the city. Occasionally, we would catch snippets of conversations hinting at debts, threats, and looming danger. The paranoia was contagious, seeping into our own thoughts. The fun, adventurous decision to hitchhike home had unexpectedly exposed us to the harsh realities of criminal networks, and it was something none of us could forget. For weeks afterward, my friends and I revisited every detail of the night, reconstructing the events in our minds over and over again. We analyzed the driver's expressions, the behavior of the masked men, the layout of the plaza. Each detail, no matter how small, became a point of discussion, a puzzle we hoped we could solve to understand what had happened and why. But despite our efforts, the pieces never fully fit together. The ambiguity was perhaps the most terrifying part. We knew we had been in genuine danger, but we would never know the full story. Eventually, we returned to our routines. School, work, and daily life slowly pulled us back into normality. Yet the memory of that night lingered like a shadow at the edge of our vision. Whenever we drove through unfamiliar areas after dark, my heart raced. Every car that slowed down, every figure in the distance, even harmless situations, triggered flashes of fear. The trauma was subtle but persistent, shaping our behavior in ways we didn't fully understand at the time. Despite the ongoing fear, there was also a sense of relief. We had survived. We had come through unscathed, physically, though mentally scarred, and that realization gave us a strange sense of gratitude. Our survival was not guaranteed. Any misstep, any lapse in caution could have resulted in a far worse outcome. This gratitude was tinged with a quiet respect for the danger we had encountered. It was a lesson in how quickly ordinary circumstances could spiral into life-threatening situations. Years later, the experience continues to influence my perception of risk and safety. Hitchhiking, something that once seemed like a harmless adventure, became something I would never consider again. I learned to respect the unpredictability of strangers, the hidden dangers that can lurk in seemingly mundane situations, and the power of instinct to warn us when something is wrong. The night of the Red Hot Chili Peppers concert was more than a scare. It was a life-altering encounter with real danger. Occasionally, I still think about the plaza, the masked man, and the gun. I replay the events in my mind, trying to understand, trying to make sense of the fear that had gripped us so completely. I imagine what might have happened if we had reacted differently, if our fear had caused a wrong move. Each scenario is chilling, a reminder that we had been fortunate to survive a truly terrifying situation. The event also forged an unbreakable bond between my friends and me. Experiencing something so intense and potentially deadly together created a shared understanding that nothing else could replicate. We learned to trust each other instinctively, to communicate silently in moments of stress, and to rely on one another in ways that were forged in fear and adrenaline. The trauma, in a strange way, became a binding experience, a shared story that would shape our lives forever. In reflecting on that night, I am constantly reminded of how fragile safety can be. A simple decision to accept a ride from strangers had placed us directly in the path of danger. What began as a carefree, fun-filled night ended in terror, teaching us lessons about caution, instinct, and survival that we carry to this day. We had learned the hard way that not every friendly gesture is genuine, that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the ordinary streets of a city can conceal extraordinary danger. Even now, when I recount the story, my voice trembles slightly. It's not just the fear of what could have happened, but also the realization of how close we came to disaster. The night of the concert serves as a constant reminder. Trust your instincts, never underestimate danger, and understand that sometimes survival depends on a mixture of luck, timing, and careful observation. Ultimately, the Red Hot Chili Peppers concert that had started with such excitement and joy ended as a lesson in fear and survival. We returned home safely that night, forever changed by the experience, and every detail, from the initial ride to the confrontation at the plaza, remains etched in our memories. The ordeal shaped our understanding of risk, danger, and human unpredictability, making us far more cautious, far more aware, and forever respectful of the hidden perils that can lie behind even the most ordinary of experiences. Though we never spoke of it beyond our tight circle, the night stayed with us, a haunting testament to the unpredictability of life and the thin line between adventure and danger. We survived, but the story of that night, the fear, the tension, and the sheer terror remains one of the most vivid and disturbing memories of our youth. This story happened to my dad back in the 1980s, long before I was even born, but it's one he still can't forget to this day. My dad was in his early 20s, full of life and utterly obsessed with cars. At that time, he had just gotten his first Mustang, a gleaming red beauty that he treated like it was alive. Every scratch or dent would make him furious, and every detail, from the engine to the interior stitching, was meticulously maintained. To him, it wasn't just a car, it was a companion, a source of pride, and the centerpiece of his young adult life. The night in question started innocuously. He had spent the evening out with a group of friends from college, just enjoying the freedom of youth. It was late, darker than usual for that time of year, and the streets were quiet, eerily quiet, in fact. After dropping his friends off at their dorms, He started the drive home to his parents' house, which was off campus, but only a short drive away. He remembered feeling tired, a little sleepy, but otherwise completely normal. It was a typical night, or so he thought. As he drove along the dimly lit road, he noticed a figure ahead. A woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, was standing on the side of the road. Her thumb was raised, signaling for a ride. At first, my dad hesitated. Hitchhiking was common in that era, and helping someone in need seemed like the right thing to do. He slowed the car, evaluating the situation. She was alone, the road around her completely deserted, and it was getting late. His instincts told him to be cautious, but his kind-hearted nature prevailed. He pulled over and unlocked the passenger side door. The woman got in without saying a word. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him, and didn't speak a single word as she pointed in the direction she wanted to go. My dad assumed she might be deaf or mute, or perhaps too shy or tired to speak. He didn't think much of it and started driving again. At first, the drive seemed completely normal, albeit slightly uncomfortable because of her silence. He focused on the road, occasionally glancing at her to make sure she was all right, but she remained completely still, expressionless, almost like a mannequin. As the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to creep in. The silence between them was oppressive, almost unnatural. My dad tried to strike up a conversation, offering a friendly, "How's your night going?" or "Where are you headed?" But each time, she merely nodded or pointed silently. Something about her behavior didn't sit right with him, and a subtle shiver ran down his spine. He told himself he was overthinking, that she was probably just shy or tired. Still, there was a gnawing feeling in his gut that warned him something was off. The road they traveled was dark and winding, with barely any streetlights. The Mustang's headlights cut through the night, illuminating stretches of empty asphalt bordered by dense trees. My dad found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Every rustle in the trees, every flicker of movement in the shadows seemed amplified. He could feel his pulse quickening, his senses alert in a way that wasn't normal for him. He kept telling himself to relax, that he was simply tired and imagining things, but the discomfort lingered. Then something happened that he would never forget. In an instant, while he was checking the rearview mirror, he glanced sideways at the passenger seat, and she was gone. Just gone. No explanation, no hint of how it happened. 1 second, she was sitting there, perfectly still and silent, and the next, the seat was empty. My dad's heart stopped. For a moment, he couldn't process what he had seen. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the asphalt, and stared at the empty passenger seat, convinced he must be hallucinating. Panicked, he quickly looked around, checking the road behind him, but there was no sign of her anywhere. No footprints, no movement, nothing. The darkness swallowed the road, and the only sounds were the Mustang's engine and his own rapid breathing. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Could she have jumped out while the car was moving? Impossible. The car had been at a steady speed, and there were no skid marks or signs of a sudden exit. Could he have imagined the whole thing? His mind refused to accept that possibility. Desperate for answers, he drove cautiously to the nearest gas station, his hands shaking on the wheel. The bright lights of the station were almost blinding after the darkness of the road, and the sight of other people brought him a small sense of relief. He parked the car, trying to calm his racing heart, and ran inside to find someone, anyone, who could tell him he wasn't losing his mind. The gas station attendant listened carefully as my dad recounted the events. From the moment he picked up the woman to the instant she vanished. He expected skepticism, maybe even laughter, but the attendant's reaction stunned him. Instead of dismissing him, the man nodded calmly and said, "You're not the first person to tell me that. That stretch of road has a history. People pick up hitchhikers there, and sometimes they disappear." My dad's blood ran cold. The words confirmed the unthinkable. He hadn't imagined it. He hadn't been hallucinating. Something truly inexplicable had occurred, something that had defied all logic and reason. The attendant told him stories of others who had experienced similar incidents, people vanishing from cars or appearing mysteriously along the road, only to disappear without a trace. No one could explain it, but the road had a reputation, an eerie, chilling one, that my dad would never forget. Shaken to his core, my dad drove the rest of the way home in silence. Every sound, the engine, the tires on the asphalt, even the wind felt amplified and menacing. When he finally reached his parents' house, he sat in the driveway for several minutes, gathering the courage to step out of the car. Once inside, he recounted the story to my grandparents, who listened with disbelief and fear. From that night onward, my dad avoided driving that road after dark whenever possible, haunted by the memory of the vanishing passenger and the sense of the unknown that lurked along that stretch of asphalt. That night changed him. It was just the fear or the inexplicable disappearance. It was the realization that reality can sometimes be stranger and more terrifying than any story or movie. The road, the silent woman, and the gas station attendant's confirmation became an indelible part of his life story. Even decades later, whenever my dad drives, there is a lingering caution, a reminder that some encounters cannot be explained and that the world holds mysteries far beyond our understanding. After the unsettling encounter with the vanishing passenger, my dad tried to convince himself that it was a one-off, some weird trick of the mind. But a few weeks later, he learned that the road's strange reputation was far from a rumor. One evening, his friend Mike, who lived across town, asked if he wanted to go for a late-night drive to clear his head after a stressful week. Hesitant at first, my dad agreed, hoping that familiar company would help him forget the previous encounter. They drove aimlessly through town, laughing and joking, trying to shake the tension from earlier events. But as they approached the infamous stretch of road, a chill ran down my dad's spine. The air felt heavier here, denser, and even Mike noticed the sudden silence that fell over the car. It was as if the world outside the Mustang had been swallowed by darkness. Streetlights flickered intermittently, barely illuminating the road ahead. Trees loomed ominously on either side, their shadows stretching like long, grasping fingers. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the distance, another hitchhiker, standing with their thumb raised. This time, my dad didn't hesitate. He slowed the car, but remained vigilant, scanning the surroundings for anything suspicious. The figure got closer, and to his surprise, it was a man, seemingly in his mid-30s, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. Unlike the silent woman, this man opened his mouth to speak. But before my dad could respond, he raised a hand to signal that he wasn't dangerous. Hesitation gripped my dad, memories of the previous encounter flooding back. Yet there was a familiarity in the man's stance that somehow seemed safe. As the man climbed into the passenger seat, my dad felt a strange tension, an instinctual warning, but also a reluctant curiosity. The man introduced himself as Peter and explained he had missed the last bus into town. My dad, still uneasy, offered a ride, making a mental note to drive cautiously. At first, the ride was uneventful. Peter seemed calm, chatting politely, giving directions to a nearby apartment complex. My dad tried to engage him in casual conversation, asking about his work and hobbies, but Peter's responses were vague, almost rehearsed. It wasn't until they reached the midpoint of the road, where the trees pressed closer and the darkness thickened, that my dad noticed something strange. Peter's eyes, which had seemed normal at first, now flickered strangely in the dim light of the dashboard. Occasionally, he would stare at my dad with an intensity that was almost unnerving. My dad tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue or the eerie environment. But the gut feeling he had learned to trust was screaming at him something was not right. Suddenly, Peter leaned slightly toward the driver's seat, lowering his voice. "You know this road has stories," he said, his tone calm but laced with a subtle menace. "People say they've seen things, experienced things, things that vanish." My dad's pulse quickened. "Yeah, I've heard the stories," he replied cautiously, trying to keep the conversation light, but every instinct screamed that he should get off this road immediately. Peter chuckled softly, almost too softly, and said, "Most don't believe it until it happens to them." At that moment, the Mustang's headlights flickered and dimmed for a fraction of a second. The world outside the car seemed to warp, shadows stretching unnaturally along the tree line. My dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the oppressive feeling of the unknown closed in. Every sound, whispering wind, the rustling leaves, even the faint hum of the car felt amplified. His heart pounded. Then, the most horrifying thing happened. Peter suddenly disappeared from the passenger seat. My dad slammed on the brakes, his mind racing. The seat was empty, again, just like the woman months before. Panic overtook him. He glanced around, looking for some logical explanation. He had to be dreaming, hallucinating, but the road was real, the car was real, and the fear was all too tangible. The Mustang's engine purred beneath him, but the silence of the passenger side was deafening. Desperate for answers, he tried to call out, but no sound emerged. His voice seemed trapped in his throat, swallowed by the darkness. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see some trace of Peter, but there was nothing. No footprints, no shadow, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the empty seat and the echo of his own racing thoughts. My dad's breathing grew shallow, and he struggled to maintain control of the car as his panic threatened to take over completely. He pressed the accelerator cautiously, heading toward the gas station he knew was a few miles down the road. Every second felt like an eternity. The trees seemed to close in around him, shadows stretching across the windshield in unnatural patterns. He could almost hear faint whispers, though he couldn't discern the words. It was as if the road itself was alive, aware of his presence, and watching him closely. The sense of being observed, of being followed, was suffocating. Finally, the lights of the gas station appeared in the distance, breaking through the oppressive darkness. Relief washed over him, but he remained on high alert, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. He parked the Mustang, practically shaking, and ran inside. The attendant, a different man than the one he had spoken 2 weeks before, noticed his frantic demeanor immediately. My dad stammered, trying to explain what had happened, but the words felt inadequate. The attendant listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When my dad finished, the man said simply, "That road, it has a history. Some people vanish, others see things that can't be explained. You're lucky to be here, buddy." My dad didn't need further explanation. He understood. That stretch of asphalt was cursed, haunted, or somehow a portal to the inexplicable. Whatever it was, it defied logic, reason, and reality itself. Shaken, my dad drove the rest of the way home in silence, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering him to the real world. He couldn't shake the feeling that the road had eyes, that it had noticed him, and that it would not easily let him forget the experience. The vanishing passenger had returned not to harm him, perhaps, but to remind him that some things exist beyond understanding, beyond explanation, and beyond control. From that night on, my dad refused to drive that road after dark. He avoided it whenever possible, choosing longer, more populated routes. The memory of Peter, the man who appeared, spoke briefly, and vanished into thin air, haunted him for years. And the lesson he carried with him was simple but terrifying. Some encounters are not meant to be rationalized. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, and some roads are meant to be feared. The weeks following that harrowing night were some of the most unsettling of my dad's life. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the empty passenger seat, felt the weight of Peter's presence before it vanished, and relived the suffocating darkness of that cursed road. He tried rational explanations, fatigue, stress, maybe even some trick of the mind, but nothing satisfied the gnawing fear that lingered in his chest. My dad began speaking cautiously about the incident, but only to a select few. He told my mom a sanitized version, omitting the terrifying detail of Peter disappearing, instead describing the encounter as odd but harmless. Friends who had heard his story initially laughed it off, attributing it to overwork or imagination. Yet, when he mentioned the road itself and its eerie reputation, some admitted to having heard similar accounts: strange disappearances, sudden vanishing figures, and whispers of shadows that moved unnaturally at night. One day, a local news article confirmed his worst fears. A young man driving late on that same stretch had reported seeing a woman hitchhiking. The report claimed he had pulled over, allowing her into his car, only for her to vanish moments later, leaving the driver terrified and bewildered. Police couldn't provide any logical explanation. For my dad, this was proof that he hadn't imagined Peter. It was real, and the road had a history of such phenomena. Determined to understand, my dad did some research at the local library, digging through archives and newspapers. He discovered that over the past 50 years, multiple drivers had reported hitchhikers who vanished mid-ride. Some described seeing figures fade like smoke. Others recounted voices that seemed to echo from nowhere. And a few even claimed to hear the faint sound of music or laughter from empty seats. There were no consistent patterns, no clear explanations, just an unsettling common thread. Those who encountered the vanishing passengers never felt fully safe afterward. One particular case stood out. A man in his 30s had seen a young woman on the shoulder of the road late at night. He stopped, offered her a ride, and while driving, she began whispering unintelligible words. When he turned to ask what she meant, she was gone, leaving only a cold chill behind. The man swore he could feel her presence lingering, a weight in the passenger seat that made it impossible to relax. My dad's blood ran cold as he read this, realizing just how closely this matched his own experience. Despite this knowledge, my dad tried to move on. He avoided the road after dark, stuck to familiar routes, and focused on his work and personal life. Yet, the memory never fully faded. Whenever he drove late at night, he found himself checking the passenger seat instinctively, a nervous habit born of fear. Friends began noticing his sudden jumpiness during nighttime drives, and even casual mentions of hitchhikers or odd roads elicited a tense glare. The experience had left an indelible mark on him, shaping the way he perceived the world. Months passed, and one evening he received a call from his cousin, who had recently moved to the same town. She mentioned she had been driving home late at night and had nearly collided with a figure on the road, someone waving for a ride. My dad immediately recognized the description and advised her to avoid stopping at all costs. She insisted it seemed harmless, but my dad's tone left no room for argument. "Some things are better left alone," he said firmly, ending the conversation with a warning he wished he had ignored himself that night. Over the years, my dad's story became something of a family legend. He shared it sparingly, often framing it as a cautionary tale. Never pick up hitchhikers late at night on that road. Always trust your instincts and respect the unknown. He didn't speak of Peter often, but when he did, his tone was heavy with the weight of lived terror. Family members who heard it learned to treat the tale seriously, especially those planning to drive after dark. The vanishing passenger had left a legacy of fear, one that lingered far beyond the initial encounter. Even as he moved into middle age, my dad's routine drives were cautious, deliberate, and measured. He made it a point to avoid the road entirely, choosing longer routes that kept him safe and sane. And yet, there were nights when the memory returned in full force: the flickering headlights, the unnatural shadows, the sudden silence, and the empty seat. He would grip the steering wheel tightly, a cold sweat forming on his brow, and silently remind himself that some mysteries are eternal, untouchable, and unknowable. The story reached its emotional crescendo when my dad shared it with me years later. I listened, wide-eyed, as he recounted the night of the vanishing passenger in vivid detail, his voice trembling at points. He admitted that even now, decades later, he couldn't fully explain what had happened. "It's the strangest thing I've ever experienced," he said, "and I doubt anyone could unless they've seen it themselves." The terror in his eyes was real, raw, and unforgettable. As for Peter, my dad never saw him again. There were no sightings, no messages, no explanations. The road, however, remained the same, dark, quiet, and watching. To this day, locals whisper about the figures that appear and disappear on that stretch, warning newcomers to drive cautiously or avoid it altogether. And my dad, having lived through the inexplicable firsthand, continues to treat it with the respect it demands, a silent acknowledgement that some encounters are beyond understanding. In the end, the vanishing passenger became more than just a scary story. It was a lesson in caution, a reminder that the world holds mysteries that defy reason, and a testament to the lasting impact of moments when the ordinary becomes terrifyingly extraordinary. My dad's life continued, marked by ordinary successes and joys. Yet beneath the surface, a shadow of that night remained, a quiet, persistent reminder that some roads should never be traveled alone, and some passengers are best left unseen. It was a rainy late fall evening in suburban New Jersey, the kind of cold drizzle that seeps through jackets and chills you to the bone. I had just finished my shift at the local diner, the Shack, a place that everyone in the area seemed to know about. Families stopped by for late-night dinners. Friends gathered for coffee and conversation, and the occasional stranger lingered just long enough to watch the world go by. I was in high school at the time, working there to save up for my first car, living with my mom, and entirely dependent on public transportation. That night, my life would take a turn I'd never forget, and it all started with something as ordinary as helping a coworker pick up a few broken dishes. The diner had been busy all day, the bell above the door jingling constantly with every new customer. I had spent the last 8 hours on my feet, taking orders, washing dishes, and serving tables. Toward the end of my shift, one of my coworkers, someone I considered a friend, accidentally dropped a tray of plates. The crash of ceramic against tile echoed through the otherwise quiet dining area. Without hesitation, I rushed over to help, grabbing shards carefully and placing the broken pieces into the trash. My hands were wet with soapy water, my fingers pruned and raw from constant dishwashing. But I didn't mind. It was a simple act, a moment of kindness that felt natural. Yet that few minutes would push the rest of the night into something far more dangerous. By the time I finally clocked out, I realized something chilling. I had missed the last bus home. I checked the transit tracker on my phone with a sinking feeling in my stomach, only to confirm my fear. No buses would be running for hours. My mom was not the type to drive me if I hadn't planned ahead. She was strict, and she believed in accountability, which meant that if I asked her for a ride after missing the bus, she would scold me instead of helping. That left me with a single choice: walking home. The path I had to take wasn't just long, it was isolated. The road from the diner to my apartment was a single stretch, flanked on both sides by dense woods. Streetlights were few and far between, creating deep shadows that moved as the trees swayed in the wind. The diner itself was somewhat removed from the nearest houses. Suburban homes dotted the landscape, but only in clusters, and each one seemed miles away. The wind whipped through the road, tugging at my jacket and chilling me further. Every step I took on the slick pavement felt like a small battle against the cold. My shoes squelching in puddles left behind by the evening rain. I tried to keep my mind off the situation by putting in my earbuds and listening to music. For a while, it helped. The rhythm drowned out the sound of dripping water, the rustling leaves, and the occasional scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. 20 minutes into my walk, though, my iPod died. Of course it had. I had forgotten the charger at home, and my battery had been running low all day. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone and started playing games to pass the time, scanning the dark road ahead for signs of life. The trees on either side of the road loomed over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind, casting shadows that seemed alive. Then I saw the headlights. A car approached from behind, the engine's hum cutting through the silence like a warning. I stopped for a moment, unsure if I should step aside or keep walking. The vehicle slowed as it drew closer, and then it stopped right next to me. The window rolled down, revealing a man I had never seen before. He looked to be about my age, dressed in a red shirt and khaki pants, uniform-like, reminiscent of Target. He asked if I was okay, his voice casual, almost friendly. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just walking home. Missed the last bus." "Ah, that's too bad," he replied. "I can give you a ride. I'm heading in that direction anyway, so it won't be a problem." There was something about him that made my stomach tighten. He seems normal to normal, polished, rehearsed, like he had practiced these words before. But my exhaustion and the cold made the offer of a warm car incredibly tempting. My brain told me to decline, to keep walking, but my body shivering and soaked from the rain, betrayed me. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I nodded and opened the passenger door. He introduced himself as David. His voice was calm, friendly, but the kind of calm that makes you uneasy when it's paired with strangers in the middle of the woods. He chatted briefly, asking where I lived and making small talk about the diner. I tried to make conversation as well, but every time I asked him a question, his responses were short and clipped. He wasn't rude, but there was a distance, a dryness that made me feel like I was being observed rather than spoken to. The rain continued to pour, pattering softly against the car roof, and for the first few minutes, I relaxed slightly. The heater warmed my frozen fingers, and the familiarity of a car's interior, the radio playing softly in the background, gave me a false sense of security. I explained my situation, how I had stayed late at work, helping my coworker, how I had missed the bus, and how walking alone was my only option. He listened silently, nodding occasionally, smiling politely, but then something shifted. His jokes, meant to lighten the mood, began to feel off. Comments about luck, about finding me in the dark, about how it was fortuitous that we crossed paths, they started to make my skin crawl. I forced a laugh, hoping he wouldn't notice the unease bubbling inside me. Every mile that passed along the quiet, wet road increased my anxiety, though I tried not to show it. Eventually, I let the hum of the tires on wet asphalt lull me into a light sleep. I told myself I was safe, that this was just a random act of kindness, that I would be home soon. But in the pit of my stomach, a warning flickered. My instincts were whispering, this isn't right. Something about him didn't feel real. Something about this night felt wrong. And that was just the beginning. For the first few minutes of the drive, everything seemed almost normal. David kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes on the road, while I tried to push my unease aside. I thought maybe I was overreacting. After all, he seemed polite enough, friendly even. But the more the minutes ticked by, the more I noticed subtle things that made my stomach twist. He avoided most conversation, responding with clipped phrases or dry nods. Every once in a while, his eyes would flick to me, scanning my expression, almost measuring my reaction. I tried to distract myself with my phone again, playing a game and pretending to focus entirely on the screen. But every so often I caught his gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. The road stretched on endlessly. Suburban homes disappeared, replaced by thick, looming woods. Rain hammered against the windshield in unrelenting sheets, streaking the dim streetlights into ghostly blurs. The heater hummed softly in the background, a false comfort against the creeping sense of dread. I couldn't explain why, but an uneasy feeling began to settle deep in my chest. Something about this night, this ride, this man didn't feel right. About 20 minutes into the drive, my eyes began to droop. Exhaustion from my shift combined with the cold and the steady hum of the tires on wet asphalt made it difficult to stay fully alert. I let my head rest lightly against the seat, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But when I opened my eyes again, the surroundings had changed drastically. The familiar suburban streets were gone. Instead, we were on a narrow paved dirt road that wound through dense woods, the rain making the muddy edges slick and treacherous. "David, I think we're going the wrong way," I said, my voice trembling slightly, though I tried to keep it calm. He didn't hesitate. There was no flicker of concern in his eyes, no apology. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed ahead, his jaw tight, muscles coiled like a predator. "Yeah, just a quick detour," he said casually. My heart raced. Something had shifted. The casual friendliness, the polite mannerisms, they were gone. In their place was something else, cold, methodical, almost sinister. I couldn't place it at first, but every instinct in my body screamed at me that I was in danger. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Another car approached, stopping nose to nose with David's vehicle. Two men got out. David said nothing at first, then told me to stay in the car. I didn't argue. My gut screamed to run, but every instinct told me to obey for the moment. I watched as the two men approached, their movements deliberate and unnerving. They spoke quietly with David, occasionally glancing in my direction. My chest tightened. Something about the scene made my skin crawl. I could hear snippets of conversation despite my attempts to stay hidden behind the rain-streaked window. Voices were low, tense. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone, threatening, commanding, was unmistakable. My pulse pounded in my ears, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I knew I had to get out of there, and soon. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt, trying to move quietly. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, careful not to draw attention. Then I heard it. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees, a sound that pierced the night and seemed to vibrate in my bones. I froze for a fraction of a second, my mind racing. The scream came from the other car, the two men, the ones speaking with David. I couldn't see clearly through the rain, but the terror in that scream was unmistakable. It made my stomach churn, my heart leap into my throat. Without thinking, I threw the door open and bolted. Mud squelched beneath my shoes, water splashing around my ankles. The trees whipped past me as I ran blindly, branches clawing at my jacket and hair. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, I could hear the rapid crunch of footsteps chasing me. My mind screamed in panic, "Don't look back, just keep running." Gunshots cracked through the night, sharp and terrifying. They whizzed past me, embedding themselves in the trees and ground near my path. I didn't stop to process, couldn't. The only thing I could do was run as fast as my legs would carry me, praying I wouldn't trip, praying I'd make it out alive. Hours, or maybe only minutes, though it felt like an eternity, passed in a blur of trees, mud, and rain. My mind raced with every possibility. Was this a kidnapping? Were they going to hurt me? Was this some kind of human trafficking scheme? My hands shook, my chest heaved, and tears mixed with the rain on my cheeks. Finally, I saw it, a highway ahead, the distant lights of passing trucks cutting through the night. I stumbled onto the asphalt, waving frantically as the large vehicles approached. One of the truckers slowed, then pulled over, his face illuminated by the glow of the headlights. I ran toward him, soaked, shivering, and terrified, explaining in broken, breathless words what had happened. Without hesitation, he nodded and motioned for me to get in. The truck rumbled down the highway, away from the dark dirt road and the forest that had held me in terror. I kept my head low, afraid to look back, afraid that even for a second I might see him, David, or the two men emerging from the shadows. The driver didn't ask questions, only focused on getting me to safety. I clung to the seat, trembling, too exhausted and horrified to speak. Eventually, he dropped me off at the nearest police station. My hands were numb, my clothes soaked, and my body shaking uncontrollably. Officers came out to meet me, listening as I recounted the events in detail, my words tumbling out in a rush. They took notes, asked questions, and promised to investigate the dirt road, though I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Still, they took me seriously enough to ensure I was safe, to check the surrounding areas, and to log every detail I remembered. Even as I left the station, calling my mom to come pick me up, I felt the lingering weight of what had almost happened. My body was physically safe, but my mind was forever altered. Whoever David was, whoever those men were, they had let me go for reasons unknown. And the scream that sound would haunt me for years. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a ghost. My body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the adrenaline-fueled run through the woods. But it was the mental weight that felt unbearable. I kept replaying the events in my mind, the cold glint of David's eyes, the scream that had pierced the night, the footsteps pounding behind me, and the flash of gunfire that could have ended everything in an instant. Even with the safety of my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still lurking somewhere, waiting. My mom arrived after a tense, frantic phone call. I remember stepping into her car and collapsing against the seat, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked at me with concern and confusion, but I couldn't bring myself to explain everything: the blood-curdling scream, the men with guns, the fact that David wasn't even real. It all sounded insane, even to me, and I knew that my mom would dismiss it if I tried to tell her in detail. Instead, I simply said, "Something bad almost happened, Mom. I just got lucky." She nodded, comforting me as best she could, though she clearly didn't understand the full gravity of the situation. Later that day, I returned to the diner. I was supposed to work my usual evening shift, but when I stepped inside, the weight of what had happened the night before pressed down on me like a physical force. Every familiar sound, every clatter of dishes, every friendly greeting from coworkers felt distant, hollow. I could barely focus on anything other than the memory of David and the two men on that dark dirt road. That was the last straw. I knew I couldn't go back to work there. The thought of walking that road again, of possibly encountering another stranger, was unbearable. I quit the job on the spot, leaving my uniform folded neatly on the counter. The police followed up a few days later. They managed to locate the dirt road I had described, though there were no signs of any cars or people from that night. They called the nearby Target stores to see if anyone named David worked there. Unsurprisingly, there was no record. Whoever had picked me up was impersonating a Target employee, likely as a way to appear trustworthy and calm any suspicions. The idea that someone had planned this, that a perfect stranger had lured me into a trap, made my stomach churn. Even more unsettling was the scream I had heard. The police never found its source. No reports of violence, no witnesses, nothing. That sound stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments, a reminder that there were things in the world beyond my comprehension, people capable of unspeakable acts, doing things I hoped I would never encounter again. I couldn't explain it, and that uncertainty made it all the more terrifying. Over the next few months, I tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I avoided walking alone, kept my phone fully charged at all times, and learned to trust my instincts more than I ever had before. Every time I saw a car pull over, my heart would leap, and I'd grip my bag tighter, prepared to run. The experience left a permanent mark, a scar in my psyche that no amount of time could erase. Eventually, I moved out of state for college. I wanted a fresh start, a place far from the streets and woods that had been the setting for that night. The new environment was safer, quieter, and the shadow of David and that dirt road felt distant, almost like a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. It had been real, and I knew I would never forget it. Years later, I still think about that night. I remembered the way David had smiled when offering me a ride, the cold precision in his movements, the eerie calm of the men approaching his car. I replay the scream in my head, try to visualize what I might have seen if I had dared to look. Each memory comes with a mix of relief and horror, a reminder of how close I had come to something unimaginable. I've shared this story countless times with friends, always careful to stress the lessons learned. Never accept rides from strangers. Trust your instincts, and always have a plan for getting home safely. But even as I warn others, I can feel the lingering fear creeping in. Because no matter how much advice you give or how cautious you become, there is no way to fully prepare for the unknown. Strangers can be dangerous, and some nights, the darkness hides threats we cannot see. Looking back, I realize that night was more than just a terrifying experience. It was a turning point. I became more cautious, more aware, and more grateful for safety. Every time I see someone hitchhiking or walking alone at night, I can't help but remember how easily life can change in an instant. And I think about David, about the men, about the scream that was never explained. I don't know who they were or why I was spared, but I know one thing: that night, I came face to face with real danger, and I lived to tell the tale. Even now, whenever I drive past wooded roads or see dark, deserted streets, I feel a flicker of that old fear. But I also feel a sense of vigilance, a reminder that I survived, not by luck alone, but by listening to the faint whisper of instinct that told me something was wrong. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all when danger comes in unexpected forms. Your instincts might be the only thing that keeps you alive.